The midday sun blazed over the Serengeti, its fierce heat pressing down on the golden plains until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Herds of zebra and wildebeest grazed lazily in the distance, their silhouettes rippling in the waves of heat. The stillness was so complete that even the wind seemed to rest. Then it came, a cry, sharp and desperate, cutting through the silence like a blade. It was not the deep, commanding roar of a lion staking its claim, but something raw and frantic. Near the banks of a slow, winding river, a lioness thrashed in the water. Her tawny fur, darkened and heavy with the current, clung to her body. Each surge of the river pulled her under, only for her to break the surface again with a strangled gasp. Her amber eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of terror and determination. On the ridge above the water, a lone man stopped dead in his tracks. He had been following the sound of vultures overhead, expecting to find a carcass. Not this. His gaze locked on the lioness, reading the scene instantly. She was exhausted, the current was strong, and without help, she wouldn't last another minute. The world seemed to narrow to that one image. A predator turned victim, fighting for her life against an enemy she couldn't bite or claw. And he was the only one close enough to do anything about it. The man tore down the slope toward the river, the sun beating into his back, his boots slipping on loose soil. He could hear the lioness's labored gasp between splashes, each one weaker than the last. Reaching the bank, he scanned the water. The river here wasn't wide, but the current was deceptive, a slow surface hiding a powerful undertow. He kicked off his boots, yanked his shirt over his head, and without another thought, dove in. The cold hit him like a wall, shocking the breath from his lungs. The current grabbed him instantly, dragging him downstream. He fought against it, each stroke pulling him closer to the lioness, who was now barely keeping her head above water. When he reached her, instinct told him to be careful. An injured, terrified lioness could kill with a single swipe, but she didn't strike. Instead, her eyes locked on his, and for a brief moment, there was no predator and no man, just two creatures who knew they were fighting the same enemy. He looped one arm under her chest, feeling the weight of her waterlogged body nearly drag him under. She coughed, a spray of river water splashing against his face, and he kicked harder, turning toward the shore. Every meter felt like a mile. The current pushed at them, trying to peel her from his grasp. His muscles screamed, the taste of silt and algae coating his tongue. Then, a flash of movement. Up on the bank, in the tall grass, shadows stirred, dark, lean shapes moving low to the ground. The rest of the pride had arrived. The shapes in the grass resolved into powerful, tawny bodies. 5 lionesses and a young male, their golden coats rippling under the sunlight, eyes fixed on the scene in the water. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, not running, but stalking, their heads low, tails twitching. The man's stomach tightened. He didn't know if they understood he was trying to help, or if they saw only a stranger touching one of their own. The river's pull was still against him, his legs beginning to feel like lead. The lioness in his grasp coughed again, her weight shifting heavily against him. For a terrifying second, she went limp. He tightened his grip under her chest and shoulder, kicking harder, willing his muscles to keep working. The muddy riverbank was closer now, maybe 10 meters, but the pride's silent approach made the distance feel infinite. One of the lionesses on shore stopped and lowered her head, emitting a low, vibrating rumble that rolled over the water. The sound froze him mid-stroke. Was it a warning? A call? He couldn't tell. The current pushed sideways, slamming them against a submerged log. Pain shot up his ribs as he shoved them free, gulping air and pushing forward again. The lioness in his arms blinked slowly, her breath shallow but steady. 7 meters. The largest of the pride took a step into the shallows, the water curling around her ankles. Her gaze never left him, unblinking, unreadable. 5 meters. His lungs burned. The river sucked at his legs, trying to pull him back. He pushed harder, every stroke a battle against both the current and the uncertainty of what waited for him on the shore. 3 meters. The lioness in his hold gave a soft, almost imperceptible groan. It was answered instantly by a chorus of low rumbles from the pride. a sound that felt both threatening and protective at once. The bank loomed ahead, a narrow strip of muddy earth fringed with reeds. The sunlight glared off the water's surface, making it hard to tell exactly where the ground began. Every kick of his legs sent a jolt of fire through his thighs, but the thought of letting go never crossed his mind. On shore, the Pride had fanned out, forming a loose semicircle. The young male hung back, but the lionesses were all forward now, their bodies still, their eyes burning into him. One of them flicked her tail in a slow arc, the only movement in that wall of muscle and fur. 2 meters. The water here was shallower, but the current still tried to pull them sideways. He planted one foot on the riverbed, feeling it sink into the silt, and hauled the lioness forward. Her head lolled for a moment, then lifted weakly toward the shore. A deep rumble came from the lead lioness, the sound so low it seemed to vibrate in his chest. He froze mid-step, unsure if she was warning him back or calling to the one in his arms. The lioness he carried answered with a faint grunt, her ears twitching. 1 meter. The first paw touched solid ground. He half-dragged, half-lifted her onto the bank, the mud sucking at their weight. The moment her hind legs cleared the water, the Pride surged forward a step, the air between them charged with something primal. As soon as her paws met the dry grass beyond the mud, the lioness collapsed onto her side, sides heaving, eyes half-closed from exhaustion. Water dripped from her fur, darkening the yellow earth beneath her. The Pride closed in. Their movements were silent but deliberate, paws barely making a sound. The young male stayed behind the others, his amber gaze flicking between the man and the lioness on the ground. Every instinct told him to back away, fast, but his legs wouldn't move, not while she lay there still breathing hard, still vulnerable. He stayed crouched beside her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his own breath ragged. The lead lioness stepped forward until she was barely 2 meters away, her head lowered, her nostrils flaring as she took in the scent of river water, blood and human. She shifted her gaze to him, holding it for what felt like a lifetime. Then without warning, she let out a short, low chuff, and the others stopped advancing. One by one, they began to circle around the drenched lioness, their bodies forming a living barrier between her and the man. The message was clear, his part was over. But they weren't finished with him yet. The lionesses closed ranks around their weakened sister, their golden coats brushing against each other as they formed an unbroken wall of muscle and fur. The rescued lioness let out a faint, breathy rumble from within the circle, a sound answered instantly by several deeper calls from the others. He stayed where he was, chest still rising and falling rapidly, his hands and forearms streaked with river mud. Every fiber of him was telling him to move back, yet his eyes stayed locked on the one he'd pulled from the water. One lioness broke from the formation, circling him slowly. Her head was low, her ears slightly back, tail swaying in the dry Serengeti air. She passed close enough that he could hear the whisper of her paws through the grass, close enough to feel the heat radiating off her body. From within the Pride, the lead lioness kept her gaze on him, steady and unblinking. It wasn't aggression in her eyes, but it wasn't exactly gratitude either. It was something older, something unreadable. Then almost imperceptibly, the lioness he'd saved lifted her head. She met his eyes for a single heartbeat, her pupils wide, her whiskers twitching with each shallow breath. Around them, the golden plains had gone utterly still. Even the distant herd seemed to pause. The next move would belong to the Pride. A faint breeze moved through the tall grass, carrying the scent of the river and the sharp tang of fear and adrenaline. The lioness he had saved pushed herself up slightly on her front legs, her muscles trembling with the effort. The Pride parted just enough to allow her a view of him. She studied him in silence, her amber eyes reflecting the dimming light. There was no growl, no bared teeth, only that steady, penetrating stare. Another lioness moved to her side, pressing her muzzle briefly against the rescued female's cheek. The gesture was tender, protective, and strangely human in its familiarity. Then she turned her head toward the man, her nostrils flaring as she took in his scent. The young male patted closer, his steps slow and deliberate. Each time his paws touched the ground, the dry soil crunched softly beneath them. He came to stand just beyond arm's reach, his gaze shifting from the man's eyes to his muddied, scraped hands. The rescued lioness gave a soft, guttural sound, almost a hum, and the others responded in unison with low rumbles that seemed to ripple through the air. The sound wasn't threatening, but it wasn't exactly welcoming either. He realized they weren't deciding whether to attack. They were deciding something else entirely. The air between man and pride felt electric, charged with something that went beyond predator and prey. The rescued lioness eased herself onto her haunches, her flanks still heaving with the effort of breathing. Water dripped from the tips of her whiskers, darkening the soil in tiny spots. Two of the lionesses shifted aside, creating a narrow gap in their living wall. It wasn't an opening toward escape. It was an invitation for him to step closer. The young male stayed at the edge of this gap, his head tilted slightly, eyes locked on the stranger who had dared to enter the river for one of theirs. Every instinct told him this was dangerous. One wrong move, one misread signal, and the pride's patience would end in an instant. But there was no aggression in their posture, only a watchfulness that felt almost ceremonial. The rescued lioness gave another low sound, softer this time, and for the first time since he'd pulled her from the water, her tail moved, a slow sweep through the grass. The other lionesses answered her with a brief chorus of rumbles, their heads dipping in unison. It was as if they had come to an agreement, and whatever it was, he was now a part of it. One of the older lionesses stepped forward from the semicircle, her golden coat catching the last orange glow of the Serengeti sun. She moved with deliberate slowness, each paw fall silent on the brittle grass. Her head dipped slightly as she passed the young male, her gaze fixed on the man. The space between them closed to just a few meters. He could hear the faint rasp of her breathing, see the muscles ripple beneath her fur with every movement. The scent of wild earth and river water clung to her, filling the warm evening air. She stopped, turned her head toward the rescued lioness, and let out a short, deep chuff. The sound was met with an immediate response. The rescued lioness rose shakily to her feet, the rest of the pride parting just enough to make room. The gap they formed wasn't wide, but it was deliberate. The older lioness stepped aside, leaving a direct line between him and the lioness he had saved. For a moment, neither moved. The golden plains around them seemed suspended in time. The distant hum of insects faded beneath the weight of the silence. Then the rescued lioness took one step forward. Her paw sank softly into the dust. Another step, and she was standing directly in front of him, her amber eyes steady and unreadable. Up close, the rescued lioness was even more imposing. Her wet fur clung to the lean muscle beneath, and each breath she drew was slow but deliberate, as if she wanted him to feel the weight of her presence. A thin rivulet of river water ran down her cheek, catching the last glint of sunlight before dripping into the dust. She lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but in measured assessment, her whiskers twitching as she inhaled his scent. The pride stayed still, their bodies forming a silent arena around the two of them. Even the young male had frozen in place, his tail flicking just once before going still. For a long moment, the lioness simply studied him. Then, without warning, she stepped even closer. So close that the heat of her breath brushed his forearm. Her nose touched the back of his hand, a brief, deliberate contact, before she pulled back again. A low, resonant rumble came from her chest. It wasn't aggressive, it was something else entirely. Something the rest of the pride immediately echoed. The sound swelled and deepened until it vibrated in the ground beneath his feet. Whatever had just been decided, it included him. And that's when the pride began to move. He didn't know what would come next. Gratitude, curiosity, or something far more dangerous. The movement started slowly, a single lioness shifting her position, then another, until the circle around him subtly rearranged. They were no longer closing in, but aligning themselves, shoulder to shoulder, with the rescued lioness at the center. The young male broke his stillness, padding forward with a quiet confidence that made the man's pulse quicken. He stopped just behind the lioness he had saved, his head lowering until his chin brushed her back. It was a gesture of recognition and protection. The rescued lioness gave a short, low sound, halfway between a purr and a growl, and the others answered in perfect unison. The air seemed to vibrate with their collective voice. Then, to his disbelief, The pride shifted again, this time parting to create a narrow corridor between their ranks. The path led away from the riverbank, deeper into the tall grass of the Serengeti. The rescued lioness looked at him one last time. Her gaze lingered, and though he couldn't explain why, he felt it carried a message, an invitation or perhaps a warning. Without hesitation, she turned and began walking down the corridor, the pride following close behind. But the path they left open, it remained wide enough for one more. He stood frozen at the edge of that corridor, his breathing still ragged from the fight against the river. The pride's formation didn't waver. Two lionesses on each side, the young male at the rear, the rescued lioness leading. Their golden coats caught the last fragments of sunlight, glowing like molten metal against the darkening plains. The rescued lioness paused a few meters ahead, her head turning just enough for one amber eye to find his. The stillness in her posture felt deliberate, as if she were waiting for something. From him. A faint rustle moved through the grass as the warm evening wind swept over them. Somewhere far off, a wildebeest bellowed, its voice carrying across the open land. But here, in this narrow space between predator and man, the silence was complete. Every instinct told him to stay on the riverbank, to let them vanish back into the wild where they belonged. Yet there was something magnetic in that gaze, something that pulled at him as strongly as the current had only minutes ago. One of the lionesses to his left took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving his face. The pride's corridor shifted subtly, as though guiding him, urging him toward a path no human should walk. The rescued lioness flicked her tail once, a signal. If he stepped forward now, there would be no turning back, and he realized they were giving him a choice. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth as he shifted his weight, testing the first step. The corridor of lionesses didn't break. They simply adjusted, each pair of amber eyes tracking his movement with silent intensity. The rescued lioness turned fully now, facing him squarely. Her ears were forward, her posture tall despite the tremor still running through her frame from exhaustion. For a heartbeat, she seemed less like a wounded animal and more like the ruler of this golden expanse. Every blade of grass and every gust of wind bending to her presence. Another step forward. The lioness to his right exhaled sharply, a brief snort that stirred the grass at her feet. It wasn't aggression, it was acknowledgement. The young male at the rear mirrored the sound, his tail swaying in a slow, deliberate arc. The corridor narrowed slightly as he moved, forcing him closer to the flanks of the predators. The scent of sun-warmed fur and wild earth filled his lungs, mingling with the fading tang of river water still clinging to his skin. The rescued lioness gave a final, short chuff, and the entire pride shifted in perfect synchronization. The motion was smooth, practiced, a single living entity turning deeper into the Serengeti's endless grass. She took the first step forward into the sea of gold, and without fully realizing why, he followed. The tall grass swallowed the sound of their movement, each stalk swaying gently in the warm evening breeze. The man could feel the pulse in his ears, every step measured, careful, as if one misplaced footfall could shatter the fragile truce holding them together. The rescued lioness led the way, her gait slow but steady. Every so often, she glanced back over her shoulder, her eyes locking with his for the briefest moment before returning forward. It felt less like she was checking if he followed, and more like she was making sure he belonged. Around him, the lionesses moved with uncanny coordination, their bodies forming shifting walls that kept him in the center. They never touched him, but their presence was constant, close enough that he could hear the faint rustle of fur brushing against grass. The setting sun painted everything in deep gold and crimson, the horizon a burning line that seemed to set the savanna ablaze. Shadows stretched long, merging until it was impossible to tell where one lioness ended and another began. They crested a small rise and the grass fell away to reveal a shallow hollow below. A den site. The earth was marked with paw prints, the ground worn smooth from use. At its center, 3 small cubs tumbled over one another in play, their high-pitched squeaks carrying up the slope. The cubs froze when they saw him. The pride stopped too. The rescued lioness stepped forward alone, descending into the hollow. And then, she looked back at him again. At the bottom of the hollow, the rescued lioness lowered her head toward the cubs. They rushed to her in a flurry of tiny paws and flicking tails, climbing against her damp fur and nuzzling into her belly. The low, steady rumble of her purr rose into the evening air, blending with the faint rustle of the Serengeti. The other lionesses spread out along the ridge, their silhouettes framed against the burning horizon. They didn't look at him now. Their attention was on the family reunion unfolding below. Only the young male kept his gaze fixed on the stranger, his golden eyes unblinking. She lay down among the cubs, curling her body protectively around them. Then in a movement so subtle he almost missed it, she tilted her head toward him, a beckoning motion. It made no sense. Every rule he knew about predators told him to keep his distance. Yet the pull in that moment was undeniable. He took one cautious step down the slope. The grass whispered around his boots, the scent of the pride stronger here. Another step. Still no reaction from the lionesses above. Halfway down, the rescued lioness lifted her head again. This time her eyes locked with his, and she gave a single, deliberate chuff. The cubs turned to look at him, and in their wide, curious eyes he saw no fear. The man descended the last few steps into the hollow, the air warmer here, heavy with the mingled scents of earth, fur, and the faint musk of the cubs. His boots pressed into soft soil, crisscrossed with paw prints, some tiny and fresh, others deep and wide. The rescued lioness shifted slightly, making space beside her. The movement was unmistakable, intentional. The cubs hesitated for only a heartbeat before bounding toward him, their oversized paws thudding softly against the ground. One stopped just short of his leg, nose twitching as it sniffed the air around him. Another, bolder, pawed at the cuff of his trousers before retreating a step. Their playfulness was at odds with the raw, dangerous beauty of the pride watching from above. He crouched slowly, careful to keep his movements deliberate. The nearest cub tilted its head, amber eyes wide, then took a step closer. Its whiskers brushed against his fingers as it sniffed them, the touch so light he barely felt it. A low, steady rumble came from the rescued lioness. Not a warning, but something that resonated with acceptance. The rest of the pride remained statuesque, their golden silhouettes still against the darkening sky. In that moment, the invisible line between man and predator blurred. The next heartbeat would decide whether it vanished entirely. The cubs lingered near him, their small, rasping breaths quick from excitement. One of them gave a tiny, high-pitched chirp, a sound so soft it barely carried beyond the hollow. Almost instantly, a ripple passed through the pride on the ridge. Heads lifted, ears swiveled forward, and every golden eye fixed on him again. The young male descended partway into the hollow, his steps slow and deliberate. Each movement carried weight, not just in muscle but in intent. He came to stand a few meters away, tail flicking once before going still. The rescued lioness watched this in silence, her gaze shifting between the man, the cubs, and the young male. Then, without warning, she rose to her feet. Droplets of water and dust shook from her coat, catching the fading light like flecks of bronze. She stepped between him and the young male, her body language calm but decisive. It wasn't an act of aggression, it was a statement. Whatever he was to her now, she was making it known to the rest. The cubs trailed after her, still casting curious glances toward him. The rest of the pride remained on the ridge, their expressions unreadable, their presence unyielding. For the first time since he'd entered the water to save her, the tension eased. Not completely, but enough for the air to feel less heavy. Something was about to happen. Something he would never have believed if he wasn't standing here to see it. The rescued lioness lingered a moment longer between him and the young male, her amber eyes narrowing slightly as she surveyed the hollow. Then in a move so fluid it seemed rehearsed, she stepped aside, not away from him, but enough to remove the barrier between them. The young male took one measured step closer, his paws pressed into the soft earth without a sound, the faint smell of sun-warmed fur and river water reaching the man before the lion's shadow did. Every muscle in the man's body was taut, ready to react, yet the young male's gaze held no overt threat. Above them, the other lionesses remained still, their heads turned just enough to watch, their tails lying flat in the grass. The evening light caught the curve of their shoulders, painting them in molten gold. A cub darted between the man and the young male, brushing against both before tumbling back toward its mother. The movement drew a short, deep chuff from the male, and then, to the man's surprise, a softer, almost approving sound from the lioness he had saved. The pride's formation shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't an attack. It was an opening. The man realized he was no longer just a stranger in their midst. He was being acknowledged. And what came next would prove it beyond all doubt. The young male closed the distance between them until barely 2 meters remained. His head was held high, mane just beginning to thicken with age, and his eyes stayed locked on the man's. The air was warm with the scent of the pride, a heady mix of sun, dust, and something wild that spoke of untamed places. The rescued lioness moved to stand beside the male, their shoulders almost touching. She gave a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to settle over the entire hollow like a blanket. In response, the male's posture shifted, less rigid, less guarded. One of the cubs crept forward again, this time coming right up to the man's knee. It sniffed at the damp fabric of his trousers, then pressed its small head lightly against him before bounding back toward its mother. The simple gesture made his breath catch. Around them, the rest of the pride began to relax. Tails that had been still now flicked lazily, shoulders loosened, and the sharp intensity in their stares softened into something else. Watchfulness without suspicion. The sun had nearly dipped below the horizon now, the sky painted in deep amber and violet. The hollow was bathed in that fading glow, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the entire Serengeti had gone quiet to witness what was unfolding. The young male took one last step toward him, closing the gap entirely. What happened next would redefine everything he thought he knew about wild lions. The young male stood so close now that the man could see every detail. The faint scars along his muzzle, the twitch of a single whisker, the slow rise and fall of his chest. The air between them was hot and heavy, carrying the deep, musky scent of the lion's breath. The rescued lioness glanced between them once, then took a deliberate step forward, brushing her damp flank against the man's arm. The contact was brief but undeniable, a gesture no wild lion should have offered. Up on the ridge, the rest of the pride shifted, their golden silhouettes catching the last light. One by one, they descended into the hollow, not with the predatory grace of a hunt, but with the slow, measured steps of a procession. The cubs darted among their legs, their high-pitched chirps breaking the stillness. One bold cub returned to the man's side, pawing gently at his boot before flopping into the dust. The young male's gaze softened, barely but enough for the man to notice. Then he looked away, scanning the hollow, as though deciding the man's presence was no longer a threat, but something else entirely. The pride had closed in now, not in aggression, but in unity, forming a loose circle that included him inside it. The low rumble of their collective breathing surrounded him, steady and strangely calm. Whatever they were about to do next would shatter every rule he thought he knew about wild lions. The rescued lioness stepped past the young male and closed the final space between herself and the man. She paused, head lowered, and for a breathless moment, he wondered if this was the instant everything would turn. Then she pressed her forehead gently against his chest. It wasn't a shove, not a threat, but a deliberate touch, held for only a second before she pulled away. The sound that followed was unlike any he had heard from a wild predator, a deep, rolling rumble, almost like a purr, but layered with something older, deeper, a sound of acceptance. Around them, the rest of the pride responded in perfect unison, each lioness adding her voice to the chorus. The hollow vibrated with their call, the setting sun bathing them all in molten gold. The cubs bounded toward him without hesitation, brushing against his legs before tumbling away again. He stood motionless inside the living circle, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. These were apex predators, untamed and unpredictable. Yet they had let him into their world, if only for a fleeting moment. As the last light bled from the horizon, the rescued lioness turned and led her family away into the sea of grass. The young male lingered a heartbeat longer, meeting the man's eyes one final time before following. Within moments, the savanna was empty again, silent but for the whisper of the wind. And he knew no one would believe the story he had to tell. If this moment took your breath away, share it. Let the world see the wild in a different light.